Here we're going to take a basic look at the spinal cord. So to orient you, you can see the two frontal lobes of the brain, the longitudinal fissure here. You can see the first cranial nerve set, the olfactory nerves. This is the olfactory bulb of each and the olfactory tract going back. You also see the remnant optic nerves, the optic chiasm where they cross over, and the optic tract going back. Right here you see the mesencephalon or midbrain. Below that, this bulbous anterior portion is the pons, and then below that the medulla oblongata. So right about here is where your foramen magnum would open, and the spinal cord continues from there. If you notice right here, the spinal cord is slightly larger than it is just distal to the medulla oblongata and just before the thoracic region. This is the cervical enlargement. You have a cervical enlargement and you have a lumbar enlargement. You do not have a thoracic nor a sacral enlargement. This structure you see right here is the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. So we haven't cut through the spinal cord here, but you can see all the vertebral bodies have been removed, and you're looking at it just an anterior view. You can also see the brachial plexus on either side here. Now, a plexus is a series of shared spinal nerves from different levels that go on to form this network, and in this case, the brachial plexus, which will innervate the upper limbs. You also have the cervical plexus here. In fact, this nerve right here is your phrenic nerve. Your phrenic nerve. This innervates the diaphragm. So it receives fibers from levels C3, C4, and C5. But if you had an accident where the spinal cord was severed above the level of C3, that individual would no longer breathe without the assistance of a machine. As we move down, I'll slide this up a bit, you can see the lumbar enlargement here, and you can see it continues down to here, the spinal cord proper. Here you can see the Conus Medullaris. This is where the spinal cord proper ends. So it's called the spinal cord proper because it is a solid cord up to that point. So this tapers down kind of in a cone shape. They call it the Conus Medullaris. And you have one central fiber coming off that Conus Medullaris called the filum terminale, which will go down to the coccygeal ligament. You see represented in gray here, and it fuses with that ligament, helps to somewhat secure the spinal cord position. While we're here, you can see the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. The lumbar plexus gives rise to this femoral nerve, and it gets its name because right here is the acetabulum, the hip socket. This is where the head of the femur would sit. This is your iliac bone, and that femoral nerve passes over the head of the femur. Right here you see the sciatic nerve, the largest nerve in your body. It innervates the lower limb along with other fibers, and there's a condition called sciatica in which this becomes irritated and basically fires impulses without input, and it's quite a painful condition. Fires impulses without input is a pretty simplistic way to state it, but you understand. We move back up and look at this thoracic region. We'll just zoom in a little bit here. You can see the ventral root of each spinal nerve coming out here. So this is the ventral root, and this orange or peach looking structure here is the dorsal root ganglion. So the ventral root is carrying motor information out. Dorsal root ganglion, where the sensory neuron cell bodies are, sits right here, and then the axons dive posteriorly and enter the spinal cord. These gray extensions you see right here at every level, these are denticulate ligaments. They're formed from the pia mater, one of our meningeal layers. You'll see that coming up in the cross-cut section of the spinal cord. And that's where we're going next. So this is just a fundamental look at the spinal cord and some of the basic anatomic structures inside. We're going to go and look at a cross-cut or transverse sectional view of the spinal cord, where we'll observe the gray matter, the tracts, and some of the internal components of this structure. So here is a model of the fifth cervical vertebrae. You can see the spinous process the transverse foramina, where you have these vertebral arteries coming up to feed the brain. So that tells you it's cervical because only the cervical vertebrae have transverse foramina. And then you see the spinal foramen here, and in the spinal foramen, we see a cross-cut section of the spinal cord. So starting at the top here, this is a ligament, and what you see here in yellow is adipose tissue with blood vessels. This would represent your epidural space. The next layer in, let me zoom this in. This next layer in right here would be your Dura Mater, one of your 3 meningeal layers, the outermost and the very tough layer of your meninges. In fact, Dura Mater translates to tough mother or hard mother. Below that, you have this little space called the subdural space, represented by this very fine little brown line right here. Below that, another gray layer called the Arachnoid Mater means spider mother. Let's bring this up. So here again, Dura Mater, subdural space, Arachnoid Mater, and this is your subarachnoid space. This is also found in the cranial cavity, a subarachnoid space, again filled with cerebrospinal fluid to cushion the brain. This innermost layer right here, this is your pia mater, means soft mother, and it's very intimately adhered to the white matter. So the white matter here is the tracts, and white matter surrounds the gray matter. These are posterior, your lateral, and your ventral horns. This is called the gray commissure across the center here. And this little channel right in the very middle, that's called your central canal, and it too contains cerebrospinal fluid. What you see here coming in is your dorsal root. The dorsal root transfers sensory information into the spinal cord, while the ventral root down here carries motor information out. So sensory in through the dorsal root, motor out through the ventral root, and here you have a dorsal root ganglion. You don't have a ventral root ganglion because a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So these are the cell bodies contained in here for the sensory neurons transmitting into the spinal cord. The cell bodies for the motor neurons coming out are actually contained in the spinal cord, so we don't see a ganglion. In there it would be called a nuclei. Where these two roots meet is your spinal nerve. Your spinal nerve. So remember, this would be a intervertebral foramen where spinal nerves are radiating out from your spinal cord. So there is your spinal cord as viewed in your fifth cervical vertebrae in a cross-cut section.